Yeah, well, just that little bit you were talking about.
What we can say is that the mediumship and spiritualist movement seemed to start in, I think it was in upstate New York, in sometime maybe the 1780s, 1800s, 1820s, I'm not sure, with two sisters who experienced these strange knockings and rappings in the house. And this eventually was construed to be a communication from the spirit world, and it attracted, as far as I know, a vast amount of interest from many people, many of who were influential and notable people at the time, and many people journeyed to see these sisters. They may have been called the Fox Sisters. And from this, the whole spiritualist movement developed, and it became, by the time we got to the Victorian age, a vast craze, both in Britain and America.
So that more or less, we're talking about 2 taps for yes, 1 tap for no.
I would imagine it'd be something like that, knockings and rappings. And this became a huge craze, and of course there were many, many fake mediums and con artists and all sorts of incredible ways of getting money out of people and fooling them took place. One of the big ones that would be that they would have the medium in some kind of thing called the cabinet, which may be a cloth box or something like that, and there would be a person hiding behind the cabinet, so they would dim the lights, and this person, who would be dressed in a sort of body-hugging clothing, would sort of creep out and pretend to be a spirit, and all sorts of lunacy was going on.
There's loads of fake pictures of ectoplasm. It's just a table napkin coming out somebody's ear.
Yeah, praying. That's right. Yeah, praying on the gullible.
Yeah.
And what is the basis of all this? The basis of all this is first of all, the fear of death, and secondly, the worry that people have about what will happen to me when I die. Because apart from the ministrations of religion, for example, the idea of the Catholic religion that if you've been good, you'll go to heaven, and if you've been bad, you'll go to purgatory, and if you're really bad, you'll go to hell. Not a great deal of information is offered in Western religion, anyway, about what happens. It's a kind of blank page, so consequently there is fear, a vast fear surrounding death. On top of that, there is also a vast degree of prohibition on mediumistic communication by orthodox religion. So people are actively discouraged, not entirely for bad reasons or negative reasons, from engaging in this type of communication. But most of the mediumistic work or medium work that's done in Britain today is by mediums who are doing or attempting to establish contact with dead relatives. People are grieving, they're extremely upset, and they are looking for confirmation of survival of death.
And there's a sort of renaissance every time there's a war, apparently. More and more people are searching for contact with people who've been killed in wars.
Well, no doubt. Do you want me to recount the Churchill case at all?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's known, I think the BBC in fact did a documentary on this, that there was a very good medium working in Britain during the Second World War, a lady who because mediumship was illegal under I think it was the Witchcraft Act or something like that, was working, of course, in private, and people were coming to see it, and she revealed to an inquirer that the ship that her son or relative had been on had in fact been sunk, and that her relative had perished. Now, the authorities found out she'd revealed this information, which in fact at that point was still embargoed.
Because we were at war.
Because we were at war, and because they didn't want to either give the enemy an advantage or whatever. And they took her to trial for treason or whatever you want to call it. The hapless woman, of course, was only doing a job as a medium. And apparently Churchill himself heard of the case and had it stopped, because he said, we're in the middle of a war, what are we wasting time and effort for on this type of stuff? This is completely irrelevant. And the Witchcraft Act, I think, was repealed in 1951, which is the year that Churchill, in fact, came back to power with the Conservative Party. So what we may presume or derive from that about Churchill's involvement or interest in such things, I don't know, but he certainly was not clearly unsympathetic.
Yeah, wasting resources.
Yeah, or he may have just considered it to be so trivial as just not to be worth bothering. We don't know. Or maybe we could know if we researched it. But since 1951, to act as a medium it has been legal. And of course, there are a vast amount of mediums working in Britain.
Well, there's an entire spiritualist church.
Yes, there is a spiritualist church, and there's a kind of college of spiritualism at Stansted, near London, which has been established for many, many years, and people can go to Stansted, learn mediumship, and so on and so forth. And this is very important. I know mediums who've been to Stansted, and they've apparently have fantastic sessions and materializations and all this kind of stuff. So this is, and then of course we've had the SPR, Society for Psychical Research, which existed since 1880, something like that, 1890, with voluminous records.
Yeah.
So it's been taken seriously, but it's not taken very seriously by mainstream science.
Well, it's not taken seriously by the media because they don't like sort of covering anything that they can't explain away in pigeonhole. No,
but it's good, attractive material because so many people are actually interested in it. Not for very deep reasons. You know, there's a lot of people you can go to, and you say a bit more than the superficial stuff, and it's like, well, I'm a bit frightened about that. I don't really want to know that much. But there's a lot of people who just want to know the basics, and the basics are very well shown in the film Ghost. And I have to go back to Ghost because it's such a clear and simple depiction of the situation. And what happens in Ghost is that Demi Moore's boyfriend, who's played by, is it Patrick Swayze or John Swayze? Patrick Swayze is murdered, and he doesn't realise that he is dead. And so he's in a position where he's trapped in what the spiritualists call the earth plane, which is the next dimension virtually parallel to and virtually contiguous with the physical world which we live in. And he's trapped in the earth plane, and what is shown there is the existence of these little nasty black entities that try and attack him and drag him down to their level. And these in turn are known as lower astral entities. So in this kind of depiction, the astral plane, which is the next plane up, next plane of survival up from the physical plane, can be divided normally into 7 levels. The lowest 2 levels are the levels that you might call hell. So this idea they have, for example, in Christianity of hell and burning hell, etc., comes from visions that people may have picked up or seen of the lower astral world. But the essence of the lower astral world, and in fact of all these worlds, is as you are and as you have behaved, so you create for yourself. There is no devil pushing you down into hell. If you are an evil person, or you've committed murder, or you will create that kind of personal hell for yourself, and you will go to it until you can perceive a different existence for yourself, in which case you may be able to...
Yeah, we see that in the Indian subcontinent with this whole idea of karma and karmic debt. If you lead a good life and you're positive, you'll presumably, be able to, go into the nice, one of the nicer levels.
I think the idea of karma is more tied up with what happens to you when you reincarnate, what you reincarnate as, and the experience that you will go through. That's what I think, rather than where you are in the interim period. But most people are not going to go to the lowest levels of the astral, and of course these would be the levels where demons, devils, and all these other nasty...
Yeah, which you see in that movie, in Ghost.
Yeah, but also larger demons than that, much nastier entities than that will be found on the lower astral. They're just like the little foot soldiers. But the real nasty people that, for example, people may try and summon up in black magic rituals and so forth will, in my opinion, most likely to be found on the lower levels of the astral plane. Of course, above the astral plane you have many, many, many other layers which can be found in many written depictions.
Yeah. Going
up to, of course, very high levels where we're going to find high angels and other advanced cosmic beings and so forth, Buddhas, enlightened Buddhas and so on. So it seems that the whole, geography and structure and arrangement of the the non-physical world is in fact rather complicated and rather complex, and not a simple matter which is going to be resolved by some basic religious ideas. You've got heaven and you've got hell and that's it.
Yeah.
Rather more complicated.
Yeah, now these spiritualist churches, they exist all over Britain. I believe that they're in America. It's more or less an international thing, isn't it? Canada, I think, has got spiritualist churches.
Possibly, but I certainly know there are many spiritualist churches in Britain. And the essence of the service in the spiritualist church is it looks rather like a conventional sort of Baptist Christian service, except instead of a minister, you have a medium. And so they go through the service and they sing hymns and so forth. And the idea of the singing, apart from anything else, is to create an atmosphere which the Spirit can work through to excite and energise the atmosphere of the building and the church. And then what the medium is doing is he's reading or getting information from Spirit and passing it to members of the congregation to help them or whatever is deemed to be required. And that is the basis of what's going on in spiritualist churches. Mm-hmm. So there may be in America as well, and Canada and Australia. I mean, I would suspect that there are.
Yeah. Now, I've got many friends who've, they visited mediums for a reading or whatever, or to ask them questions. And a lot of people record, and they have an ordinary audio cassette tape. And you've had the advantage of a lot of people is that you do have a good working knowledge of modern digital recording gear. And you did have one opportunity to actually make a very, very good broadcast quality audio recording of one of these instances where you were actually seeing a medium.
Well, back in the 70s, I worked for 5 years with an extremely good trance medium and this was virtually every Sunday for 5 years in a private circle. This was not money paid. This was no commercial gain, no commercial advantage, purely for the interest of the inquirers. And this man, we would sit in the lounge of his house and his wife would be there and maybe several other people and so on. To start the process, we would go to a deep red light. You turn off the normal lights, go to a deep red light, and the gentleman would sit in the chair. The man, I think when we started, he was about 45, something like that, and he would sort of slowly sink into a deep sleep trance-like state, and gradually certain persons would start to speak, and they often start speaking in some kind of foreign language, which I suspect was Sanskrit.
Wow.
One word which was used often was pandit, and pandit I know means friend. Yes. But there were other words spoken very fast, which I couldn't work out, but I suspect it was Sanskrit. Anyway, and then eventually what you would call the gatekeepers or the guardians who would look after the whole session on the other side would come through and they'd say, right, we're going to bring through this speaker and this one's going and this one's coming. And the speakers would come through and talk about many subjects, be it the nature of life on Earth, the nature of the afterlife, the nature of life on other planets, how to distinguish between false mediumship and real mediumship, and many, many other topics. At that time, we recorded using the veritable audio cassette, which was the technology du jour, you see. And we made transcripts, written transcripts of this. But the actual tapes are obviously of not particularly good quality. I left this circle in about 1980, and we resumed very briefly for a couple of sessions in 1992. Now, of course, technology had moved on enormously, and we had this, much superior digital technology. So I was able to record, in effect, a couple of broadcast quality sessions of this, and I have them.
Wow.
If we are allowed to use any of it, I'll have to ask the
spirits.
Yeah, the spirit world if they agree to it being used.
Okay. Now, we were just talking outside about Swedenborg. I've got a couple of really, really good videos from the Swedenborg Society. Apparently, again, they've been running for a very, very long time. Is there anything you want to say about the Swedenborgian movement, whatever it's called?
I just don't know enough about it.
Okay.
I know it was very important in the whole...
Yeah. these influential characters that's continued.
Yeah, I can't, at this point, I can't say too much about it.
Am I right in saying that Edgar Casey was more or less a medium?
Yes, Edgar Casey is perhaps arguably one of the most famous mediums that ever existed. And all his work is well documented and is held in a foundation at Virginia Beach in Virginia, in the US. Now, as I understand it, Casey was an uneducated farm boy who came to notice in the 1930s. I think he was also referred to as the sleeping medium or something like that. And what he would do would be to go in a very deep trance, and I think people would speak through him or something like that. But what essentially he did was people came with health problems, and he would give them advice on how to cure their problems. And there are hundreds, perhaps even thousands of cases on record in the foundation of people who came, outlined their health problem, and he would say, right, you must do this, you must take that, you must eat this type of food, and so on. And this is absolutely documented stuff. This is not...
And he was, presumably being helped like the shamans by a spirit.
Well, I guess so. There must have been a whole team behind him who knew how to not only resolve the problems, but first of all to look into the karmic background of the patient or the inquirer. But it seems clear that Casey himself didn't have the knowledge to be able to do it from his own subconscious mind. He was, a guy who left school at a very young age, as indeed was the chap who I worked with. He left school at 14. And although he was an intelligent man, you couldn't say he'd been highly educated. And he was coming out with stuff week after week after week. And if you'd been churning that out with the vocal characteristics and so forth, and syntax that he was using, you'd have been at it all week preparing. It would have been a full-time job, in my opinion.
That's interesting, isn't it?
To produce an hour or an hour and a half of material, and to just virtually flawlessly deliver it, and maybe act out 5 or 6 characters over that period of time, and give out a massive, complex material. Where are you getting it from? You've either got an extremely severe multiple personality disorder, or you're some kind of absolute genius, or it's the real deal. And after, we used to dissect it for hours. Of course, he himself wouldn't know what had happened. So he'd go out, and the speaking would go on, and then he'd sort of come around and say, right, and we'd tell him, this was going on and that was going on.
Yeah.
So I think it was the real deal.
Now, in your experience with, really what can only be described as the highest level audio technology, in the world, and you've had many years involved in that kind of world, have you ever come across any device or electronic gear that somebody's claimed you would be able to use it to hear messages? This famous case with Spiricom, this weird electronic voice kind of thing, which I don't know very much about, but have you ever come across anyone who's been trying, or maybe with radionics, to create a device where a person who does not have these special mediumship gifts could maybe have a machine to communicate?
Well, yeah, there's two areas, one of which you certainly know about, which is electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP. And this appears to have started with I think he was a German experimenter called Konstantin Raudive, who was just running ordinary tape recorders, and he started noticing that there were words appearing, and there were no microphones connected to the tape recorders. I think this is going back to the 1950s or 60s. Yeah. And since that time, many people, and to this day, many people experience with audio recording. And they either put a microphone in a quiet room, or they run some kind of recording device, and they do get snatches of words, and so on and so forth. What happened in radionics was that 2 of the pioneers, which is Ruth Drown and George de la Warr, both developed radionic cameras which apparently could see into the physical etheric world and take distant photographs of the patient who might have been many, many miles away. And these, there's about 12,000 photographs taken by de la Warr. So this is not a small amount of material This is a substantial collection, and these are held in America by I think it's the Psychotronic Association.
Now, when you say that these cameras can look into the so-called physical etheric world, is this one of these layers or levels?
Yes, this is.
About earlier?
Yeah, this is kind of equivalent to what you would call the earth plane. It's the immediate next energetic level up, and in esoteric theory, yogic theory, and radionic theory, we hold that the physical form is immediately energized and informed by what we call the physical etheric body. So this is the immediate layer, which is, as it were, holding, in our opinion, holding your physical body together. And illness, in its most immediate form, is the result of a disturbance to the physical etheric body. It's actually much more complicated than that, but that's where we start. So it seems that what he was photographing, for example, if you had a tumour or whatever he may have photographed, it was a photograph of the energetic equivalent of the physical tumour. And these, I heard a lecture by the man who currently has the camera, Dr. Peter Moscow, and he had taken some of the plates to a university in the States. They'd analysed the plates and they'd found out that although they were two-dimensional pictures, they'd run some process on them that showed they were three-dimensionally encoded. So these are three-dimensional pictures of tumours, and they kind of look like X-rays, black and white X-rays.
And well, when you see an X-ray, you mean you can sort of see a form on the photograph that correlates directly to the subject that was photographed? Or
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I saw some photograph of I think it was a bowel tumour, and what you see is a kind of very large, bright area, which is standing out absolutely from the rest of the background. And there are various other pictures that I've seen. One is of a child in the womb, and so on and so forth. But at this point in time, because we're now going back, I think De La Warr died about 1960-70, we're going back to a fairly obscure situation because no one now can get these cameras to work. And by the way, they don't look like cameras. It's just called a camera, but it doesn't look like a digital camera or anything like that. It looks like a rather complex contraption with spirals in it and all sorts of...
Wow.
And he took out a patent on this, by the way, which is in France. The patent was granted in France. So presumably if you search patent records, you can find information on this.
Now, I'm sure a lot of us have seen these Kirlian photographs that have got sort of colours in them. Is the radionic device able to show you colours?
In those days, the devices they had did not show colours, but I think it would have been quite a difficult process to develop your own colour plates. But remember, Kirlian photography is a different technique, and what they do is they have a piece of glass.
That's it.
They have a piece of film, I think, on top of the glass, and they let loose a very large static discharge of about 30,000 volts underneath the glass, and this seems to energise the aura of the living object on the other side, and create this static discharge which they can view on the plate or the film.
Yeah.
And also, what you're filming must be present. With radionic photography, what you're filming was not present, could be anywhere in the world. And that's the difference.
That's strange.
You know, you don't know it. Maybe this technology could have been developed so powerfully that it could be used for all kinds of spying. So maybe the spirit world has not let it be developed. We don't know, but imagine if you could have a camera that you could tune in to look into a secret research facility. You see, we've had the remote viewing movement, which of course has been very well publicised, but imagine that's only people writing down what they visualise and see through remote viewing. What if you could actually have a device which you could tune into any location on Earth, or maybe even on other planets, and take photographs of secret installations and so forth? Maybe this has not been allowed by the spirit world. I don't know.
Wow.
But it seems odd that these cameras existed and suddenly no one can get them to work, and they don't, you know.
These kinds of sort of wispy, sort of force fields, if you like, that you see in Kirlian photographs, are these, in your view, you know, sort of showing the so-called physical etheric body, which is very close to the physical body?
Whatever it's showing, it certainly seems to have a valid diagnostic use, because they can tell by the integrity of the field which is displayed on the plates and so forth, the general energetic state and possible illnesses in the person. This is what I understand about Kirlian photography. So it seems, whatever it's showing, it seems to have some kind of valid purpose.
Well, the reason I asked that question is because there's this really, really famous Kirlian double photographic thing that you see in many books where you've got a leaf and it's got an aura coming from the outside of the leaf. They then chop the leaf in half, photograph it again. You can still see the outline of the leaf before it was cut.
Yes, then it's feasible. It's some kind of representation of the physical etheric field. But one of the things they do is they take a photograph of someone's hand and then they get them to eat a hamburger, and they show what happens to the human energy field after you've eaten the hamburger. Or they will get a piece of fresh fruit or fresh food, and they can take a series of photos over a couple of hours, and they show how the energy field deteriorates. So if you're going to eat fresh food, you need to grow it in your own garden and eat it as you pull it out of the ground to get the maximum energy from it.
Wow.
All this stuff you're buying in the supermarket that could be months old, that's been kept in freezers, might taste okay, but energetically it can be absolutely useless. And this can be shown by, for example, Kirlian photography, I suppose, or dowsing or whatever.
God, that's interesting.
You've not heard of this?
Well, obviously I understand that, if you have the land and everything, then you should be, making good use of it and eating, what you've got complete and utter control over when it's really, really fresh.
So you want to talk about to rescues or anything like that?
Well, you mentioned this thing earlier, where there was a sort of tragic situation where this little girl died under extreme stress.
Okay, well, some part of mediumship, which is much less well known than the usual survival of death scenario, is that some mediums specialise in what is rather arduous and emotionally demanding work of rescuing people who have died and don't know that they're dead. So they're trapped in the earth plane or the earth continuum, and of course this is a timeless or a zone without time, so they may have been dead for hundreds of years. They can appear as ghosts.
Yeah,
and
there's plenty of photographs of family members standing behind their families long after they've died in family photos.
Yeah. Now, and in a sense, you see this in the film Ghost and also in The Sixth Sense, where they don't know they've died, and a rescue is performed to take them up to the next world. But I myself have been involved, I think, in just 4 of these rescues, and in 2 of them, I remember I was fast asleep and I was kind of woken from sleep right in the middle of the night and told to go up to a chair that I sit in to meditate and so forth. And I'm like saying, well, what do you want of me? What's all this about? And just had to sit in the chair and wait. The next thing you know, I was like sort of aware of the presence of this little girl, and she'd been burned to death in a fire in a kitchen, and she'd sort of been trapped in this layer. And this just went on for a short amount of time, and I kind of mentally said to her, don't worry, it's going to be okay. And they just came through and they got her out of there and they took her up to the level that they took her.
And these are referred to as rescues?
Yeah, these are called rescues. Yeah, this is called rescues. Some people do many rescues. And the other one that was done at that time was then the next thing I became aware of some chap who I think had been killed in the First World War. And here we're probably talking sometime in the 1990s when I was doing this. And he was, he was chatting to me like, I don't know where I am. And he was telling me all sorts of things about himself, and his life and so on. He said, I seem to have been here for a long time and I just can't quite understand it. And, I've still got my uniform on, but, no one's around and it's very odd. And suddenly it was like, right, we're coming in now. And they just, the spirit persons that do the rescues on the other side just came in and took him off to, as they say in spiritualism, to the light. And so I was used in some way, and to this day I don't exactly understand why it had to be me and what exactly I did, but for some reason I was a contactable person who maybe could just tune in and just allow them to open a gate or a door to get through. But this certainly happened. It's not something I've done a lot of, just those, and there were two others, I think. I don't remember now.
Wow. Is there anything you want to add or you want to say?
Well, is there anything you need me to add? You know, I mean, you're the...
No, it's absolutely brilliant.
Any other questions?
Really?
I mean, you know, Bert gave a pretty good summary as well, so you've got plenty to go on.
There's a lot of correlations, you see, between you two.
But interestingly, a friend of mine used to live with a woman who was a medium, and she specialised in rescues, and apparently one time Crowley himself came through.
Wow.
And you'd have to ask him about this in more detail, but apparently he was an absolutely furious contactee, and he created a lot of trouble and was in a complete rage, and it was an extremely arduous and difficult situation.
What you're saying is that he was trapped.
Well, I don't know the whole thing, but he came through this woman, and for whatever reason, and it was quite intense and disturbing. So you need to ask. I can put you in touch with the person concerned, and you can get some input on this.
It seems to me that you do get spirits that you could almost grade in terms of their activity and their strength. And I don't know whether I mentioned it in one of my talks earlier this week, but I've never ever seen, I've done a lot of reading, I've never ever heard of or ever seen any evidence where you've got a full body apparition, say, that people report, where that apparition has any kind of ability to move an object like we associate with poltergeists. And what I see is that if you've got a spirit that's actually able to move an object, it's putting all its effort into that and it can't be seen. Whereas then you get the other side and you get spirits that put all their effort into making themselves visible, and yet they're very, very weak. And there's a classic case with the Skull group. And the spirit came through, and they called in, and the spirit just said to them straight away, it's been very hard work to get here. He said it's been like walking through custard. And have you ever had any visual things, lights or anything like that? Not
really, but I don't consider myself particularly mediumistic compared to some that I've met. But occasionally I will get a very strong mental image of, for example, a person or persons who may come into the room. But usually I don't get these. You need to speak to real clairvoyants and clairaudience who can... occasionally I've had words said to me when there was no one in the room. Like you're sitting in the room doing something and you'll hear Nick in your ear and you go...
Well, that's very similar to what we hear with these EVP tapes, because normally what happens, you record an entire tape and you have to sit there and listen to what should be a silent tape, and what happens is that all of a sudden you hear a very short thing and you listen to it over and over again and you realise that that is some voice that's a very long way away, and it's usually saying somebody's name.
Well, I've had it like right in my ear a few times, where they just like someone goes right in your ear, and you go like, you turn around and there's just no one there, no one else in the house, and you wonder,
Well, to wrap up then, we started by saying, there's people that really they're dying in a really pretty bad way because they have all this fear and they're sort of knotted up with the fear of death. Would you say that that fear is not necessary whatsoever because, there is this important spiritual element to us that does survive, it does go on, and really the mums and dads tabloid kind of image of death where it's just you just die and that's it.
Well,
it's not true.
It seems to me, on the balance of probabilities, that we survive what's called death as coherent, conscious entities, and we enter a world which is as real and substantial to us as is the world we are currently in at the moment, and we have our bodies intact. And this appears to be the actual situation. However, because many people do not believe in these things, they go over and they can be either trapped or in a state of confusion. So my understanding is that there is a large effort in the spirit world of people who specialise in rescuing and, as it were, getting people who die and bringing them upwards into the next world properly and getting them settled and put into, as it were, comfortable or appropriate, because not all who go over are good.
Yeah.
Another aspect, of course, is that just because you go into the next world doesn't mean to say you suddenly become a nice angelic person with wings on your back. If you're a nasty piece of work in this world, doesn't mean to say your ego or your arrogance or whatever it is immediately just going to vanish, and you're suddenly going to become a nice lovey-dovey person. You know, you may leave this world with an awful lot of anger and rage and what else, and this is not necessarily immediately just going to evaporate. You'll grow a pair of wings on your back, get a harp, and off you go.
Doesn't happen.
You know, there's a lot of quite angry people in the spirit world. There's also many, it is said, there are many people in the spirit world who, because of wars and circumstances on this planet, are plucked out of this life before they have done what they need to do here and before their time. And this is also regarded as a kind of major problem, because wars have killed tens and tens of millions of people, particularly in the last century, and many of these people perhaps did not fulfill what they came here to do. And this creates a disturbance perhaps in the fulfillment of destiny and karmic objectives. So this potentially could create difficulties in the spirit world, because it's all become uneven and unbalanced by these kind of distortions.